Hello, everyone. It's time to get started. Sure.
Sure. You can stay there. Use the handout. Good morning. Welcome to our second plenary. We're ready to hear Timothy Brooks give us a very interesting talk. But before that, I just wanted to make a quick announcement to all the young scholars who are officially part of the Sylvia and Warren Samuels Young Scholars Program, and also to the HES Executive Committee members. Remember, we have the Young Scholars lunch right after the plenary in the ballroom next door, right? So you're all welcome to join us, all the people that I just mentioned, for the lunch that will take place right after the plenary. Okay, so Margaret, please.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Margaret Schabas, and before starting, I want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So I'm delighted to welcome Timothy Brooks to give our plenary lecture. He's originally from Toronto and took his first degree at the University of Toronto, and then went to Harvard, where he did his master's and PhD in history and Asian languages. He spent much of his early career at the University of Toronto, promoted right up to full professor, taught also at Stanford and Oxford, but came and settled at the University of British Columbia here in Vancouver in 2004, and also served as principal of St. John's College, a graduate college at UBC that has pre-war roots from Shanghai. We sit here on the Pacific Rim, and I think it's very appropriate that we now gaze westward to China. Occasionally, we have scholars here from China. I've been to a workshop that Terry Peach held, or a conference, some of you were there, in Shanghai, and we had a whole day about the Han Dynasty Chinese thought on economics, but we tend to underrepresent that part. So I think it's absolutely wonderful that we have one of the world's most renowned scholars of Chinese history with a specialization in the Ming Dynasty. He's written about 10 monographs and overseen 10 edited volumes. He's served as editor-in-chief of the Harvard University Press 6-volume History of Imperial China. He's had his books translated into a number of other languages, not least into Chinese. The reason Ross Emmett invited him is before his delightful book that I recommend highly, Vermeer's Hat, with Bloomsbury Press 2008, where he takes a painting of Vermeer and he traces the origin of all the elements in the painting to the far corners of the globe. And it helps to debunk the myth that globalization began last year. So I think that's quite an important book. He has just recently retired from the University of British Columbia, so we'll miss him very much. But he has a wide range of interests: Confucian statecraft thought, 17th century English thought. He works on globalization, as well as, of course, his specialization of Chinese history. And the talk today is a part of a forthcoming book with Princeton University Press, The Price of Collapse: The Little Ice Age and the Fall of Ming China. Please welcome Timothy Brooks.
Thank you, Margaret. This is my mic a little too strong for you? Well, no, it's good. Okay. Maybe I'll just remove this a little bit. I'm really pleased to be here because as I think back over my career, I started learning Chinese when I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. And my goal was never to just disappear inside sinology. It was always to take what I found. I mean, I wanted to contribute to the field of sinology, and I think I did that. But my goal was always to try and take what I learned and bring it out into a more global and comparative perspective. And you are the perfect audience for some of the ideas in the next, in my upcoming book. Sorry, let me just go back. Oh, yes. Sorry for the pitch, but it might be a book of some interest to people in this room. And today's talk really is going to focus on the opening chapter of the book, in which I think about how did Ming Chinese, that is Chinese of the late 16th and 17th centuries, think about the economy in crisis. Now, I started out really with an interest in Asian philosophy. I shifted that more to social thought, then to broader cultural issues, and ended up in society, Chinese society. And I did it during a period in which the Jesuits are starting to come to China, and there's the beginning of this really fruitful interaction and period of accommodation between Chinese merchants and intellectuals and European merchants and intellectuals. And that's led me in two directions. One is to think about trade and the economy, global trade, and the way in which that has shaped the modern world. This is where Vermeer's hat comes out of, and the price of collapse is also part of that. But it's also, I've also been led to think about comparative politics and political systems and international relations from an Asian perspective. So that's another stream of thought that I've been doing. Now, I'm not a theorist. I work in what I like to call low theory, if you like, generalizations based on the work that I do as a historian, but I hope it has some theoretical implications. What I'm going to do today is go through 5 topics to start with the global crisis of the 1640s, move on to grain prices as climate proxies, and at that point, then I'm going to shift to the question of what did Ming Chinese think prices were, and how did they think about prices? And then how did they think about abnormal prices? Because abnormality is often the condition under which a more stringent kind of logical thought needs to be applied to the world around you. And then I'm going to end up with the main point of the talk, which is the authority of market prices in Chinese economic thinking. Well, I'm going to start with an example of the kind of material I've been working. I started collecting prices in the 1990s, and it's taken me forever to sort of scoop up enough prices to be able to say anything about the Chinese economy during the Ming Dynasty. And I'm going to use, this is one of my best sources, and it's written by a school teacher in a village southwest of Shanghai, otherwise utterly unknown. He wrote 2 essays, one in 1641 and one in 1642, because he was so overwhelmed with the complete collapse of the economic and climate system that he had known through his life. And it's this kind of record, this is where I find my data. We don't have the sort of data for 17th century China that you have for Europe, where you can get price lists from markets and that sort of thing. That does not exist. You have to go and find it sort of bit by bit. So Chen Qide says, I'm going to quote a little bit more than what you see on the screen. My memory goes back only to the opening years of the Wanli era. So this is the 1570s, when I was just a boy, and there were always bountiful harvests and prosperity. The price of a peck of grain, roughly 10 liters, was only 3 or 4 cents of silver, which translates into a little over 1 gram of silver. As you may know, China did not coin silver. It worked in with raw silver. In the blink of an eye, the year 1588 arrived. Drenching rains soaked us, turning near and far into one vast slough. The following year, 1589, the earth was parched for 1,000 miles. For 2 months, there was not a spoonful of water in the rivers, nothing but rank weeds. At that time, if you could put together a pickle of grain, 107 liters, you could get a price of 1.6 taels of silver, so about 60 grams of silver. When 1640 arrived, heavy rains fell for months on end. The entire landscape in all directions was a great swamp. Those with upper stories resorted to them as bolt holes, while those without scrambled onto their roofs or climbed up onto terraces, having no thought in the morning but whether they would survive until the evening. The price of grain started at over 1 tael per hectoliter, 38 grams of silver, and gradually rose to over 2 taels, or 75 grams of silver. The next year, the drought demon wrought disaster. The river stopped flowing completely. The price of a hectoliter of grain was driven from 75 grams up to 112 grams. Rural people had to pay 40 cents of silver, or 15 grams, for just 1 peck, or 10 liters of grain. Not a single item of everyday use was less than several times more expensive than it had been. Laying hens and geese cost 4 to 5 times more than before. As a result, a family of 8, unable to feed themselves, treasured pig fodder. Middling families could not afford to raise a pig, birthing sows having been sold off to pay expenses. Previously, a stewing pig might have fetched 37 grams of silver, and now just the head cost 30 to 35 grams. So what Chun is doing in this, this is his way of quantifying disaster. He quantifies it in terms of prices. And a lot of other writers in this period do, which is why I have collected this material together. My original intention was to write a price history of the Ming Dynasty, but I'm not an economic historian. And my data weren't robust enough to do that. Where my data converged were in these kinds of disaster scenarios. And that is what led the book that was supposed to be about price history has turned to be into a book about the impact of climate on human society in China. Now, the link between climate and grain prices in a pre-industrial economy is fairly direct. The amount of energy the earth receives from the sun that has an impact on the warmth and the water that reaches grain in the fields, and that in turn shapes the price that people have to pay to buy grain. Climate scientists have tended to prefer physical to documentary proxies. That is, things like tree ring data and glacial ice core isotope analysis. And these have been very productive for giving us a sense of how climate change has unfolded over the last couple of millennia, in fact. But in recent decades, climate scientists have been turning more and more to historians and drawing on the kind of thing that we work on. Materials we work on, historical chronicles, diaries, letters in which contemporaries record their observations about unusual weather, and in the case of China, how much you have to pay for anything when unusual weather strikes. These kinds of documentary proxies don't have the consistency, perhaps, that tree ring data does, but they are more valuable in their sensitivity to local conditions, to moments of sudden change, and most of all, to the impact that that change had on how people managed their lives. And perhaps the evidence of how you manage your life is no stronger than in the prices you have to pay for things. So my contribution to our understanding of the Little Ice Age is the prices to which grain rose during climate crises, and most particularly in the mid-1540s, late 1580s, late 1610s, and finally the late 1630s, early 1640s. Now, I'm not going to give you much data. These are graphs of the number of prices I was able to find at stretched across between 1444 and 1644. And it gives you a sense of whenever I'm finding a lot of data, it means that the crisis is getting bigger and bigger. And I've also tried to use Chinese documentary materials to determine when is the weather warmer or colder, when is it wetter or drier. And the most intense period of climate crisis in the Ming Dynasty is in the last 7 or 8 years. And this, of course, is the period featured in Jeffrey Parker's magnum opus Global Crisis, and China was very much a part of that. And my data certainly reinforces that China is experiencing the climate of the Northern Hemisphere in ways very similar to the way in which Europe was experiencing the global crisis of the late 1630s and early 1640s. Now, when I started, I'm always trying to think comparatively. So when I started reading comparatively about prices in the 1630s and 40s and climate change, I was surprised to discover there isn't much literature on the European case. I mean, I've got a couple of articles here in my notes of people who have written essays on grain prices as a way of trying to understand climate change. And in fact, I contacted Jeffrey and said, I've looked through your book for any data on grain prices. And he wrote back and said, well, that's because there isn't any. He didn't use any grain data to write his history of the global crisis. But I would say from a Chinese historian's point of view, my most valuable data is the data, is this emergency grain data. I'm not going to talk anymore about those findings. What I want to do instead is sort of use that as a background to think about how did Chinese think about prices? What are prices? How do they move? And what do they mean? I'll get to Xu Guangqi in a moment. So what did Chinese think prices were? Well, or maybe I should say, what is normality? And for Ming Chinese, normality was that everything remains the same. Nothing changes. Price aberration is a sign that something is going wrong. And it's not just going wrong in human systems. It's a much larger vision that they have of a kind of cosmological aberration that is going on. Now, Ming Chinese understood that prices rose and fell in relationship to market supply, in relationship to demand. But they also believed that under normal conditions, prices, if they rose, subsided back to normal. Or if they sank briefly, they returned to normal. There was this idea that the price mechanism would reflect a kind of stability of the overall system, and that it would return to that stability. The language they use for this is that prices should be ping. Ping means level, and it's a word, it can also mean stable, it can mean fair, and in fact, there was another term that was used more broadly for the economy, and that is gongping. Gong means the larger public, ping means fair or level, and that the goal or the, maybe I shouldn't call it the goal, but the idea of a stable and healthy society is one in which conditions are fair for everyone. And they focus particularly on prices as a way of trying to understand that fairness, because if a price favors some people over other people, that creates unfairness in the economy, that creates disturbance, and that's a sign that something is wrong in the larger system. So a fair price, and this is a concept, and they use the word ping for a fair price, a price that is, it's not just stable, but it's fair to everyone. A fair price was one that both buyer and seller could accept because it met a shared expectation. You knew how much you would be able to sell something for. You knew how much you would be able to buy something for, and within that sort of matrix of prices, you could conduct your economic life. An abnormal price favored one player over another, whether it was the buyer or the seller, and it was not fair because an unfair price created a relationship in which one person benefited at the expense of another. Now, I've put up Xu Guangqi here. He's the man on the right. He was the highest ranking Catholic convert in the early 17th century in China, was a close associate of Matteo Ricci, the Italian Jesuit who went to China in the late 1580s, and who constructed some remarkable intellectual and ethical bridges with his Chinese counterparts in the Chinese gentry elite. And he and Xu Guangqi had a particularly positive relationship. They co-translated Euclid, for example, into Chinese. And I want to cite Xu because he was a very active official in Beijing. He eventually, just before he died, is promoted to be Chief Grand Secretary, which is the highest political post in the land. He was concerned, and I'm going to quote him here, that grain should be plentiful and prices fair, so that the crowing of roosters and the barking of dogs echo each other. That is, you can go from one village to the next, you can hear that each village is alive and well, and economic life is proceeding. According to this model, and I quote Xu again, people should not face the trouble of having to ship things over great distances in order to garner adequate profits. Now, Xu here is, he's not against trade, and it's one of the stereotypes of Confucian thought is that Confucianism is allergic to economic transaction. And I don't think that's true, but there is one problem that sticks up at the end of that comment. And he said, people should be able to garner adequate profits. And here he's starting to edge out of the Confucian camp and think more broadly. And I'll get to that in a moment. So Xu didn't want to deny the validity and the value of economic exchange, as some Confucian fundamentalists might have done. He wanted to imagine a system in which commercial exchange brought benefits to everyone, so that if you had a surplus, you could send it out into the exchange networks, you could profit from that, but not profit to an extent that that was a hardship for other people in the system. Now, merchants at this time are starting to offer the same kind of argument, that trade was good for the whole of society, but also more explicitly that trade leveled prices. If prices were out of whack, the way you brought prices back to normal was to facilitate trade. So there was a stone inscription put up in 1638 in a village, a commercial village just west of Shanghai, and put up by the Cloth Merchants Guild there. And it was a bit of self-promotion, but they got the local magistrate to sign off on it. And in this inscription, they say the members of the guild swap prices to make a living. They bought at one price and sold at another, and they always bought at a fair price and sold at a fair price, not cheating even a child, so that the people could enjoy access to goods not immediately available to them. So what the merchants are saying is, we're not doing something nefarious here. We are buying and selling in a way that can distribute the goods of society in a way that is fair to all. Now, of course, these merchants wanted to be seen as virtuous men, and many people in Chinese society and in every society have been a little skeptical of what merchants get up to. But as a public declaration, this was their attempt to create a positive reputation for commercial exchange. And as the declaration closes with the phrase that the merchants set their prices according to the quality of the goods, so that the people can exchange what they have for what they lack. Well, Chinese were not alone in thinking that prices should be stable, or that trade could be a means for achieving that fairness. Europeans, as you will all know, developed a parallel discourse of just prices in the 17th century. And based on the conviction that prices should be stable, while also recognizing that of all prices, grain was the most volatile. And when grain prices got out of whack, that was the greatest threat to a society. Now, the idea of keeping prices stable and fair was not just a positive benefit, but in fact, it was an act of justice in some of the rhetoric that we see in 17th century England. So I turn to Craig Muldrew for some of this information. I've pulled up He's already up. Gerard de Malins, who wrote in his handbook on commercial practices of 1622 that the inequality, trade does not favor the inequality whereby one thing exceeds the other, but rather prices endeavor to bring them into an equality. And the language of equality struck me a great deal because ping, the word for fair prices in Chinese, is very much this idea of equality. And in fact, the character for ping is in fact a balance. So you want prices to balance out fairly with each other. So we're finding that much the same thing being said in China and in England in the same decade of the 1620s. And there are other examples I could bring up. William Scott in 1635 declaring, quote, prices to be the true measure of things in a just system. So behind this idea that prices are fair is a kind of larger sense of justice that is at work. And again, drawing from Craig Muldrew's work, he explains that these writers believe that a fair and just price should also be the cheapest price that the system can sustain. Fair prices serve to ensure a free supply of goods equally available to all, so that goods could be afforded by the rich as well as the poor. A price had to be cheap enough that everyone could afford it, but also high enough that those selling are going to make a profit. And so we come to the problem of the concept of profit. I mean, people of the Ming understood that supply and demand determine prices and determine fair prices. But they were allergic to this particular concept of profit. And the locus classicus for this is Mencius, a Confucian philosopher of the BCE period. And it came up in this very famous passage in his writings in which King Hui of Liang, he went to visit the king, and the king said, and I have it up there, excuse me if I just step out and read this. King Hui said, "Venerable sir, you have not considered 1,000 li too far to come. Surely you have some means to profit your state." Well, the word profit just set Mencius off. Mencius said, why must the king speak of profit? You have I have only teachings concerning humaneness and rightness. If the king says, how can I profit my state? The officers will say, how can I profit my house? And the gentlemen and the common people will say, how can I profit myself? So this allergy to profit got established very early in the Confucian era, and it became a bit of a barrier for Confucian thinkers to get themselves past profit. Now, I've already quoted Paulo Hsu earlier. He used the word profit. He thinks there should be profits. They should be adequate for the needs of people who are making the profits. But this has always been a kind of a problem for Confucian political thinkers. And I think it really was set aside at the end of the 16th, early 17th centuries. Now, fairness didn't rule out, and this allergy to profit didn't rule out the reasonable use of market forces to ensure that producers were recompensed for their products. A farmer could wait and sell his crops when the price rose, and he wouldn't be condemned for pursuing profit. It would be understood that he's working in a reasonable self-interest that society as a whole should be able to accommodate. And so too, when a merchant moved goods from a market where they were cheap to a market where they were more expensive, it was understanding that he could charge more in the other market, but that entailed transport costs and various other transaction costs, and that it's fair that he should seek a higher profit in another market in his own interests, in a way that served the people who needed the goods that he was transferring to the other market. So a famine relief expert by the name of Yu Sun in the late 17th century said, regardless of whether we are talking about state grain or people's grain, the price should always rise and fall with the current price and should not be forced up or down. And to get the current price, you relied on the market. When the price is high, merchants come from far away. They will naturally be numerous. Grain being abundant, the price will then level itself through the intervention of merchants. And so I'm just putting Shu back up here because most of these people I'm talking about, we have no visual images for them. But these are sort of the three main concepts that step forward and become prominent in Confucian statecraft writing in the early 17th century. Pingjia, the idea of a level price; Shijia, the idea of a market price; and Shijia, a current price. And you had to, if you were a responsible official, you made sure that prices were ping, that you were relying on the prices that were in the shi, in the market, and that these were the prices that prevailed at the moment, not at some other absolute time, but at the moment. Okay. Now, having laid that out, how did Ming Chinese think about abnormal prices? Well, I'm going to give you, this is the main reason I've done a PDF is so that you can see the following scenes. This is from a memorial that was sent to Emperor Wanli in 1594 as a flood was beginning to create a famine in eastern Hunan and western Shandong provinces. And this is where I think it's one of the best illustrations of the particular Chinese anxiety about aberrant prices. So you start out with a natural disaster, in this case, a flood. The flood causes a shortfall in the grain harvest. Grain is not available. And so people start selling whatever assets they have in order to raise enough money to be able to buy grain. So in this picture, you are seeing the woman in the center of the picture on the right receiving a pot of grain in exchange for her child, who is down at the bottom. The child is being traded for grain. And in famines, famously, the price of children collapses during famines, and you're lucky if you can get enough grain to survive a couple of days by selling your kid. But it's understood that this is a price and that many people were obliged to pay it. Then you get to the point in which there is no more grain left in the economy. And so people start stripping bark off trees, digging roots out of the ground, eating leaves and so forth. This is then followed by the step that no Chinese official wanted ever to see happen, which was the step into cannibalism. Because cannibalism is the most uncivilized practice imaginable. But cannibalism was sometimes a resort in extreme environmental crises. And then beyond that lay civil unrest, rebellion, bandits getting together to rob people of whatever grain they might have in their houses. So it's a complete collapse of the social order. Now, behind all of this, there is a cosmology at work. You could even call it a theology, and that is heaven. Heaven produced rain. So if heaven was withholding rain and the crops were drying out in the fields, it was because heaven was unhappy with something that was going on in the human world. And that unhappiness could be what the emperor was up to, but it could also have to do with what the people were up to, that they were not living moral lives and heaven was putting them on notice. And since rain came from heaven, rain could also then dump an enormous amount of rain on people. You'd have a flood, and the same thing was going on. Now, we live within a different cosmology, of course, but even we take disruptions in the weather and as a warning of environmental degradation and climate change, which is to propose that we don't stand at all that great a distance from the Chinese. Our metaphors for what is going on in the environment are different. For them, it was heaven responding to human action. And for us, it's the larger global ecosystem responding to what humans are doing with carbon, for example. So for us, the world is a physical ecosystem vulnerable to changing conditions. And for Ming Chinese, it was more like a metaphysical board game in which heaven directs the action. And if something disastrous is happening, humans are responsible for that. So the architecture of ideas is not the same, but both systems ask us to think about human agency. Now, in the Chinese case, the key actor, it was understood in Ming China, the key actor in responding to price aberration and climate disaster was the state. And the final image in this series of images that the official Yang Dongming sent into the emperor is a picture in which he depicts himself kneeling, kowtowing to the emperor, and begging the emperor to intervene. So there is this understanding that the solution to the problem ultimately is a political solution, not exclusively. I mean, in fact, this particular famine in 1594 was solved by an official allowing prices to rise to a level at which grain merchants would then start shipping private stocks of grain into the famine area in order to alleviate the famine. But it's understood that the state has to be a key player in this. Now, the state could affect grain prices in any number of ways. One was that they had a reporting system. Every 10 days, every magistrate, there's over in every county in China, over 1,000 counties, every magistrate every 10 days had to send in the price of grain to Nanjing, which is where this data was kept and analyzed, so that the Ming state could see where is there dearth, where is there abundance, if there are price differentials, should the state get in and motivate economic actors to move grain, or in fact, should the state move grain? Now, in Beijing, this was assigned to the officials of the dreaded Eastern Depot, which was a kind of secret service reporting to the emperor. These guys were not particularly wanted in the markets of Beijing, but they went down once a month, not every 10 days. They went down once a month to check the price of grain, and also the price of beans, the price of cooking oil, sometimes the price of meat, in order to determine what's going on in Beijing, because political stability in the capital was extremely important, of course. Institutional entropy meant that this data collection started to change. Well, it went from every 10 days in 1552 to twice a year. And then by the turn of the 17th century, nobody was reporting prices anymore. Although in Beijing, the imperial household was keeping an eye on prices. So that's the first thing you do as a state, you monitor prices. The second thing that the Ming state could do was to mandate the prices at which commodities were sold. Now, the Ming state doesn't do this a great deal because it was understood that you let the market find where the current price is, you do everything you can to assure people that that current price is one that they can afford. But there are times when Ming officials would intervene in a local market when it seemed that somebody was trying to drive up prices by keeping grain off the market and driving prices to an unnatural level. So mandating prices was a way of trying to prevent human interference in the economy. A third thing that you could do is, as a local magistrate, is that you could prosecute merchants who were engaged in price fixing. It was accepted that merchants were the agents of healthy markets, although, as one magistrate Riley observed, quote, letting a broker in the market set commodities would be like allowing students to monitor their own misdeeds in school. So there's an understanding of the role that the merchant should play. There's also an understanding that merchants aren't always going to play the role that they should. And local judges could then step in and prosecute merchants. Another way, and this is probably the most common way in which the state intervened in prices, was to release grain into the market from government granaries. and to block merchants who loaded up grain barges and were trying to take grain out of areas where grain was needed into other areas where they could get a higher price. So that the state, the goal was, and I'm quoting an official in Nanjing here, ensure that the price of rice remains fair and the people will have more than enough food for their use. Now, this, it seems to me, and I'm not enough of a historian of Europe to do a contrast here, but I'm relying on François Gipoulou, who published a book some years ago called Elusive Capital. And he makes the point that the Chinese state intervenes to dampen distortion. I like that particular way of phrasing it. Whereas, and I'm quoting him here, in Europe, on the other hand, political fragmentation into multiple sovereignties led to a complex order which allowed economic forces to become autonomous and the dynamics of capital accumulation to be set in motion, allowing, at the end of a legal and economic clarification process, a form of development driven by the quest for productivity. And China, being in a single state model, a single state structure, was in a different position. I like this idea of the state trying to dampen distortion. I think that's what the Chinese state was doing. Well, I'm going to put our terminology back up here because I want to talk finally about what I referred to here as the authority of market prices. The founding emperor of the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century was adamant that his officials, if they needed anything, pay market rates, and he uses the expression market rates. This is in this goes into the dynastic law code in 1397. He imposed a law that made selling goods in the capital above their current value, another expression here, that became a capital crime. And if you tried to sell things above their current value, you could be executed for doing so. I don't have any cases in which this has actually happened, but we could probably dig up a few. Now, his son, the Yongle Emperor, in 1403, extended this rule outside of the capital to every village, town, and city in China, that to sell above the current value was a capital crime. Again, I have no evidence that anyone was ever executed for doing so. But these and other laws found their way into the Ming legal code. And the punishments for interfering with market rates had to do with how much the price that a seller was asking varied from the market price. Small variation, they wouldn't execute you. Huge variation, it could be a capital crime. Now, in practice, commercial exchange is a rough and tumble zone where officials, like everyone else, were often out for themselves. And for Confucian philosophers and moralists, this was a constant worry, as it was for their Christian contemporaries in Europe. And to quote Jacques Le Goff here, Christian moralists were anxious about the loss of true value in the face of money. And if anything served to constrain this reduction of everything to a price in a free-for-all market, it was the Christian virtue of caritas, the care of others, that was part of what was termed the care of souls, including one's own soul, so as to earn sufficient virtue to be admitted to heaven. As long as caritas was in play, the abstraction of money was not powerful enough to clear a way for capitalism to override the obligations of justice. Now, people of the Ming would have understood the idea of the virtue of such constraints, though they would have understood it in the Confucian terms of the mutual obligation of people towards each other, rather than the salvation of souls. They would have found the notion that money was part of the arrangements by which human beings were subordinated to the grace of God, puzzling and, well, really incoherent. The anxiety they shared with their European contemporaries was over the danger of allowing greed to overwhelm obligation and prices to alienate the poor from the rich, which is really where I'm going in, well, where the illustrations we've just seen from the petition, the official's petition to the emperor is going, that as social obligations are abandoned, the outcome is going to be chaos. It's a radical departure from market prices. Well, a radical departure from market prices was therefore a moral warning, sustained by the economic logic that markets serve to supply people with what they need. Now, the ideology of capitalism, and I'm probably saying this in a room where you know much more about this than I do, the idea that capital is value-free and generative of universal benefits. I'm speaking here of late capitalism, I suppose. That ideology did not follow for China. But nor did the ideology of Confucianism as a system in which rich and poor provided mutual support to each other. Because in the real world, prices invariably array rich against poor, and price-based exchange continually re-embeds social inequality in a society. Ensuring that prices were fair was not a bid to detach the economy from society. It was a bid to keep economy and society linked, so that the financially advantaged and commercially astute did not deprive the poor of their means of survival, especially when climate crisis was destroying the crops in their fields. So at both ends of Eurasia, people experienced the early phase of the economic growth we call early modernity against the background of the impact of the Little Ice Age. And that caused them to worry that price calculations in the pursuit of wealth were eclipsing the calculations of virtue and care. And the Little Ice Age only seemed to underscore this peril. So the closing question that I'm going to pose to myself and to you as well, and it's not a question that I address in my book because I don't have a persuasive answer for it, but the closing question is, did these waves of price crisis through the Ming period induce this way of thinking? Did Confucian practical statecraft philosophers in the Confucian tradition, did they change their understanding of how the economy worked in the face of the kind of crises that they had to weather in this period of the Little Ice Age? I'm tempted to say perhaps, but that would require a lot more research that I haven't done yet. So I can't actually give a full and clear answer to this. I mean, you can find similar arguments about market prices and fair prices before the Ming Dynasty, but the arguments for the authority of market prices seems to have been strengthened, especially in the later period of the Ming Dynasty. And that this, I think, had something to do with what's going on in the real world. And private charity was not enough to resolve the problem. The state had to be present, which is why I think even down to today, it's understood that the Chinese state has a large role to play in the economy. Sometimes the market has to be corrected, and you can't expect the market to correct itself, just as you can't expect school kids to discipline themselves for their misdemeanors, as I just quoted. It's necessary for the state to intervene. All right, that's enough Chinese history for you. And if I want to close on just by making a pitch for the value of thinking comparatively on the question of economic thought. And that what I try to do, I'm always thinking comparatively. I try and ask what is commensurable between what was going on in China and what was going on in Europe. What is distinctive in the two cases? Where do those distinctions arise? And I tend not to want to reduce those to some, fundamental cultural orientation, because both societies were dealing with very similar problems. And yes, they're shaped by their religious worldviews, their philosophical worldviews. But the distinctions may be, in fact, far smaller than we think they are, and the commensurabilities may be far larger. How do we then put these into a larger vision that allows us to speak about the history of the world as a place in which all of this is going on at the same time, and in which all of this should ideally be creating the narrative that we are writing for world history. And yes, well, I'll leave you with the Yang praying to the emperor and the concept of market price. Thank you.
Question?
So you said one thing there that I think is really interesting, I think deserves a lot of investigation if you haven't already, that trying to sell above current value, because at least from an economic perspective, that sounds like absolute nonsense. Like I would say the current value is what the price is. So like say
Yes.
you can't, so what I'm like,
Right. No, I think I misspoke on that. That the current, what I wanted to say is current value fluctuates. Current value is not set. And so if you're selling it, if the current value is above where the price should be, but not hugely above where the price should be, it's understood if that is the current value, then that's the price that has to be paid. But the hope is to modify or modulate the range of price variability so that no one is profoundly disadvantaged by the current price going up.
okay, well, I think, okay, so I think what I'm going to say still applies. That still is a form of price control because if you're allowing it to modify somewhat but not too much. So I'm not like I have a paper about Jewish price controls I'm working on where they have a law that in some ways is similar. That in the Jewish law it says you cannot charge more than 1/6 above the market value. And there are some rabbis who have said, well, that's not a price control because we're allowing the price to vary. And I'm like, well, what if a famine hits and the market price increases by 50% and you're only allowing them to charge 1/6 more? And like I saw like one contemporary rabbi who's also an economist who's like, well, that's no problem. When supply and demand shifts, the market price will change and you're allowed to charge them the price. And I'm like, well, no, but if you tell the individual merchant they can't charge more than 1/6 of the old price, how are we ever going to get to the new equilibrium? Like he's thinking of a very static equilibrium without thinking about the process in between. And so I'm thinking there might be something similar here going on where they think they're allowing the price to vary, but they're not really letting it vary as much as it needs to. Or let's say think about price controls today, like rent control. What would often happen is the government wouldn't be like, oh, no, rent today is $100. Let's set a price control at 50. They're not that stupid, but they would be like, well, the price is 100, so let's ban it from increasing by more than a certain percent every year.
Right.
Well, that's not bad today, but in a few years from now, you're going to watch the city collapsing into rubble.
Right. But the situation you're describing is a situation in which prices vary wildly and inflation over time can reach very high levels. And the way in which Ming Chinese imagined the economy is that prices do not rise. Now, there was an understanding there might have been maybe a rate of inflation across the dynasty of maybe somewhere well under 1% per annum. So it's a very slight rate of inflation. And their idea of how an economy worked, I mean, their experience reinforced that because what you paid for rice in 1570 was roughly what you paid in 1470, close to what you paid in 1370. So it's an economy in which prices are the sort of describe the way in which the normal world should work. And what caught my attention in the data that I've collected is that that's when the prices just shoot up, sometimes tenfold above, sometimes even more than that, above ordinary prices. And this, I think, then forced a lot of people in official positions to ask the kind of questions you've just asked. I mean, what do we do? There is no, we don't have enough grain to get it back in the market. We can't force the price down if there's not enough grain to feed everybody. And yet we don't want people scalping the poor. So it sort of depends, I think, on the assumptions that the tradition we're speaking of, whether it's the Jewish tradition or the Confucian tradition, the assumptions that tradition brings to bear on how the economy works.
Another question over
Yes, hello. Thank you. This was really amazing. A question about the legacies of these ideas as well as the possibilities of thinking comparatively, in the sense that when I was listening to you, I thought that this really invites the comparison with the argument put forward by E.P. Thompson in The Moral Economy of the Crowd. So it got this scenario in which centuries later, the subaltern classes appeal to the provisions of the Elizabethan era to challenge not just the fact that the price was too high, but the whole order, the whole idea of political economic community being trampled upon. So even though, as you said, clearly the dynamics of capital accumulation are very different in Europe and in China, what is the legacy of some of these ideas? Do we have the sense that centuries later there was an appeal from people to a previous idea of what the state should be doing? And
Yes.
to what extent can we push that comparison? Or it's completely different.
Well, I think one significant difference for me as a historian of China is that it's very hard to hear subaltern voices in the late 16th century. We get glimpses of them sometimes, often in a fictional settings rather than in real settings, because subalterns are not telling us what they think. So the materials we have are usually at the lowest you go is down to sort of the village elite level. So like Chen Qide, the guy I cited at the beginning of my talk, local village school teacher, reasonably well educated, sort of hanging on to the lower end of the rural elite, just barely. And he is voicing his sense of outrage at what is going on. Presumably that outrage reflects what subalterns are thinking. And those subalterns would from time to time act by storming the storehouses of the local rich and relieving them of their grain, of their grain supplies. But at the level of Confucian philosophy, there is not much room for saying the anger of the populace is the basis on which decisions should be made. There is anxiety about the people turning to rebellion, but that anxiety is usually expressed to warn the emperor to say, you've got to intervene here, because if we have an outbreak of rebellion, the difficulty and costs of controlling that rebellion are going to be enormous. So intervene, do anything you can to move grain into the area where there's a grain shortage. So I'm not sure that this could be generalized quite into a sort of an E.P. Thompson framework, but I mean, the world in the 19th century was facing some pretty severe climate constraints as well. And as I recall, Thompson is writing mostly about 19th century. I read him when I was a graduate student. It's been a while, but so there is a sense of, and I guess this goes back to the question of justice, that in the European case, justice is a very strong concept that can be used to direct or to underpin arguments that are being made. And in the Chinese case, it's there too, but it's not, it's kind of justice in practice. It's not justice as a kind of abstract concept. So I think there's a level of abstraction in the European concept of justice that operates a little differently in the European context.
Thank you.
But I'm speculating here. I'm not really a specialist on this kind of economic philosophy.
I was just, thank you. That's a very interesting session. I wonder if you could expand on state provision of grain. Before you touch prices, did they start developing a sort of, storehouses of grain, which could act as a buffer, and also possible taxation of the rich instead of grain during periods of famine? I mean, maybe you can say a bit more about that. Thank you.
Well, as I think is probably true in any economic system, the state mandated that grain be stored to a degree that would get you through, actually at the beginning, I think it's 3 years of famine. So the founder of the Ming Dynasty said, we've got to build 4 granaries in every county city. We have to fill it with enough grain so that we can survive through 3 years of famine. But you then leave that to the local official to keep up the grain supply. The grain rots, it's not replaced, the granary falls apart. So that by the time the severe crises of the 1580s and 1640s come along, the government doesn't have that much grain to release onto the market. And what interests me as a historian of China is the degree to which local officials figure out how to interact with the market in order to bring the grain in. So in fact, while I have stressed the presence of, or the role that the state has to play in all of this, in practice, often the state resolves a problem by interacting with private merchants and getting them to move the grain that needs to come in, and sometimes giving them incentives to do so. So it's in a time of crisis, the state and private commerce end up working closely with each other. Not in a way that is legislated or in a way that is laid out in a kind of legal framework, but through a kind of practical solution to a problem the state itself cannot resolve. And that's why, I don't want to stress too much the idea that this explains why the government of the People's Republic of China is so involved in the economy, but it is somewhat continuous with the traditional practices.
Well, we've run out of time,
Oh.
so I just want to thank Timothy Brook for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Rice for lunch. That's great.
Yeah, that's great.